Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to get into the mind of John Wayne Gacy Jr.
John Wayne Gacy Jr., a man whose name has become synonymous with evil.
And we're going beyond just, recounting the facts of his crimes. We've got so much to go through.
Yes.
We've got court documents, biographies, tons of psychological assessments. We even have letters from Gacy himself.
Yes, we do.
Well,
A mountain of information to sift through.
and we're going to try to use all of it to really get a sense of how this guy went from seemingly normal to a monster.
Right.
And to guide us through all of this, we're going to be looking at Gacy's life through the lens of Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to be a fascinating deep dive, and at times it's going to be pretty unsettling.
Yeah,
We use psychological theory to try and make sense of the senseless.
right.
And it's almost like a thought experiment. What if we could rewind Gacy's life, identify those crucial turning points that shaped him? What would we learn, not just about Gacy, but about human nature itself,
Right,
the fine line between good and evil?
exactly. So, John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born in 1942 in Racine, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our sources paint a really vivid picture of his family dynamics.
Yes.
Like a very strained relationship with an abusive father who was an alcoholic and this doting, overprotective mother.
Right.
I'm curious, how much do you think those early relationships played a role in how he turned out?
Well, Gacy often described his father as this volatile, unpredictable figure, especially when he was drinking. He was physically and verbally abusive and often took it out on John Wayne.
Right.
And then his mother, on the other hand, was incredibly protective of him, almost to a fault.
Well, and some of the sources give really specific examples of this.
Yeah.
Like the enemas his mother used to give him, or when she gave him her underwear to wear, and his father found out and just beat him savagely.
Yeah, those incidents suggest, I think, a very complex dynamic. You have a mother who's trying to shield her son from a really hostile world
Yeah.
and maybe compensating for the lack of a stable father figure.
Right.
But on the other hand, that overprotectiveness may have, stifled his development in a way,
Yeah.
prevented him from exploring his own identity, asserting independence.
So it sounds like even in this earliest stage, this is what Erikson calls the trust versus mistrust stage. We're already seeing disruptions.
Exactly.
So instead of developing, a secure sense of trust, Gacy's world is unstable.
Yes.
There's violence and these really mixed messages about intimacy, boundaries, all those things.
Absolutely. And when we look at the next stage, that autonomy versus shame and doubt stage,
Yeah.
we see more complications.
Okay.
His father's harsh punishments probably instilled a deep sense of shame in him,
Mm-hmm.
particularly around his sexuality.
Mm-mm.
But his mother's overbearing nature at the same time might have also prevented him from developing a healthy sense of autonomy.
So he's caught between these two extremes.
Exactly. He's unable to assert himself without fear of reprisal.
So it's not just that he experiences this trauma, it's the specific nature of it, right? Like
Right.
it's this push and pull between these two powerful figures that probably had a huge impact on him.
Yes.
It makes you think, how could any child navigate that kind of environment and not come out of it deeply affected?
It really is.
Yeah.
And as he moves into adolescence, these early wounds we begin to see manifest in some new and really disturbing ways.
The sources describe him as being kind of a loner,
Mhm.
frequently transferring schools, struggling to fit in.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he shows this entrepreneurial spirit.
Yes.
Like he's always coming up with ways to make money, refurbishing and selling things.
right.
Like hustling in a way.
And that drive to succeed, to be financially independent, might have been a way of compensating for this lack of stability and control at home.
Yeah.
He was looking for validation, trying to prove his worth outside of that chaotic family dynamic.
So we're seeing a connection between this and the initiative versus guilt stage, right?
Exactly.
Where he's taking initiative, he's being resourceful,
Yes.
but it's almost like he's overcompensating for something.
Yeah.
Like he's trying to erase the guilt and shame from his father.
It's a really interesting observation,
Mm.
but I think it's worth considering. If that need for control, for validation, continued throughout his life,
Yeah.
maybe it even fueled his ambitions, the desire to be a successful businessman,
Right.
to be respected in the community.
And maybe even played a role in his darker impulses. Right?
Yeah.
The need to have power over others, to manipulate them and control them.
It's a chilling thought.
Mm.
And as he enters adulthood, we see these complexities get even more intense. He leaves home, goes to Las Vegas, ends up working in a mortuary.
Wow.
He starts having his first sexual encounters, It's a period of exploration, but it's also a time of just a profound confusion. He's trying to figure out who he is, where he belongs in the world.
And that lines up with Erickson's stage of identity versus role confusion, right?
Yes, for sure.
He's experimenting, playing with different personas, just trying to forge an identity. But it seems like those earlier wounds are still there under the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And, his experiences in Vegas, especially being exposed to that darker side of human nature, it might have warped his views of intimacy and relationships.
Yeah.
He was surrounded by exploitation and deceit and fleeting connections. All of that probably reinforced his own distorted view of things.
So we're seeing this interplay of so many different things. This traumatic childhood, struggles with identity, these experiences in Las Vegas all coming together during this critical time of identity formation.
Right.
And as we get into his early adulthood, things take a really sinister turn.
Yeah. Because on the outside, it looks like he's building a really good life.
Yeah.
He moves to Iowa, he gets married, starts a family, becomes a manager at Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Wow.
He's active in the community, he's involved with the Jaycees, he's seen as a real up-and-coming guy. But under that surface of normalcy, something very dark is brewing.
And then in 1968, that darkness explodes. He gets arrested for sodomy. He's accused of assaulting a teenage boy.
Right.
It's a turning point that really just shatters that facade he's worked so hard to build and shows how deep his depravity goes.
Yeah, it's a moment that really makes you question the nature of compartmentalization. How could somebody like Gacy, seemingly so well integrated in the community, with these positions of authority, be capable of such awful acts?
That's a question that I think continues to fascinate and horrify people. And the sources we're looking at offer some potential explanations, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So he does some time for this sodomy conviction,
Right.
but it doesn't seem like he learned his lesson
No.
because he gets out and goes back to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like almost immediately he just starts down the same path.
Yeah, and this time it's even more calculated.
Okay.
It's more insidious.
Really?
He gets remarried, starts his own construction company,
Wow.
PDM contractors.
Okay.
And he just embeds himself even deeper into the community.
He's really trying to present this image of being a good guy.
Yeah, he's throwing these lavish parties. He's volunteering for the Democratic Party.
It's almost like he's overcompensating, for that past transgression.
Right.
But all the while he's doing all this behind the scenes.
Yeah.
He's engaging in these increasingly brazen acts of violence.
That's right.
The number of young men who are going missing is going up.
Yes.
And the police are starting to think maybe Gacy's involved somehow.
And this is where we can start to look at the psychological profile of a serial killer.
Okay.
We're seeing these patterns of behavior that are really common among people who commit these kinds of crimes.
Like what kinds of patterns?
Well, a lot of times there's this sense of grandiosity,
Okay.
this belief that they're above the law, that they can outsmart the authorities.
Right.
They get pleasure from the act of killing itself,
Wow.
from the power that they have over their victims.
Yeah.
And there's a complete lack of empathy. They're just totally detached from the suffering that they're inflicting.
And it seems like all of those traits were present in Gacy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He planned his murders really carefully. He kept trophies from his victims.
Yes.
He even seemed to have this twisted sense of pride
Right.
about how he was able to get away with it for so long.
Exactly. And that sense of pride,
Yeah.
that belief in his own cleverness,
Right.
that's ultimately what led to his downfall.
How so?
He got overconfident, he got careless,
Uh-huh.
and eventually the police caught up with him.
And it all started with the disappearance of Robert Piest in 1978.
Right?
A 15-year-old boy who went missing after talking to Gacy about a possible job.
Yeah.
This time, the police didn't just write it off as a runaway case.
No.
They zeroed in on Gacy. And what they found was truly horrifying.
Yeah, the discovery of those bodies buried under Gacy's house.
Wow.
That was a turning point, not just in the case, but in how we understand the very nature of evil. It just completely shattered this idea that monsters only exist in the shadows.
Right.
It forced everyone to confront the possibility that evil can be hiding in plain sight
Yeah.
in the faces of the people that we know and trust.
And that's what makes this case so disturbing. It's not just the brutality of what he did.
Yeah.
It's that this guy seemed so normal,
Right.
so integrated into society.
Exactly.
And yet he was capable of these horrific acts.
And as we get into the trial and imprisonment phase,
Yeah.
we see even more of Gacy's psyche revealed.
Okay.
His manipulation, his desperate attempts to control the narrative,
Right.
his complete lack of remorse.
Yeah, from what I read,
Mhm.
it seemed like his behavior during the trial was almost theatrical.
Yes.
He claimed that he was insane.
Right.
He tried to charm the jury.
Mhm.
He even tried to shift the blame onto the victims.
Yeah, which I think shows a profound disconnect from reality,
Mm,
even with all the evidence against him. He just couldn't or wouldn't accept responsibility for what he did.
right.
It was always somebody else's fault.
Right.
There was always some outside force that was driving him to do these things.
So it seems like he built up this wall around himself
Yeah, like a mental fortress.
of denial and justification
Exactly.
that let him hold on to this idea that he was in the right, even as he was being convicted of these awful crimes.
And that's something we see a lot with people who have antisocial personality traits.
Okay.
They just don't have the capacity for empathy,
Mm,
for remorse,
right.
for real self-reflection.
Wow.
They see the world as this game to be manipulated,
Right.
and they see other people as pawns to be used and discarded.
So Gacy ends up getting convicted on 33 counts of murder,
Right.
and he's sentenced to death. But
Yeah.
even on death row, he doesn't just fade away.
No.
He keeps painting,
Mm-hmm.
writing letters,
Right.
giving interviews.
He becomes this macabre celebrity, this figure of morbid fascination.
And in those letters, we get these glimpses
Yeah.
into his mind.
Into his really twisted worldview.
Right. And it's chilling.
The letters are really a window into his mind.
Yeah.
And he almost never expresses any remorse for what he did.
It's really striking.
Yeah, he mostly focuses on how he's been wronged, on his art,
Right.
on how he wants the public to see him.
And that need to control things, even from behind bars.
Yes.
It's really something.
It speaks to how powerful his ego was,
Yeah.
that even facing death,
Right.
he still couldn't let go of controlling the narrative.
And it brings up a question that we're still trying to figure out.
What is it?
What makes someone like Gacy do what he did?
Yeah.
Is it pure evil? Is it mental illness?
Right.
Or is it something more complicated? Like a
Yeah.
combination of different things?
Right, like this perfect storm of darkness.
And that's the question that we're going to try to answer
Okay.
as we go into the final part of our deep dive. We've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive looking at John Wayne Gacy Jr.'s life.
Yeah, trying to understand what made him tick.
Right. What led him to commit those awful crimes. But now that we're wrapping things up,
Yeah.
I keep thinking about the victims.
That's what stays with you long after everything else fades.
Right. The trials are over. The headlines are gone.
Yeah.
People move on.
Right, but the victims and their families,
Right.
they have to live with this forever.
Their lives are changed forever.
Absolutely.
And from everything we've looked at,
yeah.
the court documents, the biographies, the
Right.
personal accounts,
All of it points to this profound and lasting trauma.
it's not just losing someone you love.
No,
Yeah.
it's the way they were taken.
It's not knowing.
The horrifying discovery.
And then to find out
yeah,
that the person responsible was someone you thought you could trust.
right. It just shatters your whole world.
And we have to remember the context, too.
Yeah, the 1970s.
When a lot of these crimes happened, young men disappearing, especially if they were gay or, on the fringes of society,
Right.
it wasn't taken as seriously back then.
No, it was often dismissed.
Yeah, like they were runaways.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And their families were left to search for answers on their own.
And they had to deal with judgment from the police.
Yeah, and even their own communities.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
It really is.
These families clinging to hope,
Mm.
but also fearing the worst.
And then when the bodies were finally found,
Right.
that relief,
Yeah.
but mixed with this unimaginable horror,
To think that someone you loved
Yeah.
suffered like that
was brutally murdered.
by someone they might have even known,
Right. Someone they thought was a friend,
a neighbor.
a pillar of the community.
It makes you question everything.
It really does.
And then there's the identification process.
Right, which was often so difficult.
So long and drawn out
Yeah. Some families had to wait years for DNA testing.
to confirm it was their loved one.
And all that time living with that uncertainty.
That limbo of grief.
It's a special kind of torture.
And then there's the stigma,
Oh, yeah.
the shame that comes with being a victim of a crime like this.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine having to tell people
I can't.
that your son or your brother
Yeah.
was one of Gacy's
It's
victims?
just awful.
The judgment, the whisper,
They're
the,
looking at you differently.
like it's somehow your fault.
or that you should have known.
Right.
It's just not fair.
No one should have to go through that.
They shouldn't.
But even with all of this,
Mm.
what's amazing is the resilience.
Yes.
The families channeling their grief into something positive.
Right, like activism.
Supporting other families,
Mm.
creating spaces to share their stories.
Yeah, and to honor the memories of their loved ones.
There was this really powerful moment
Oh, yeah.
in one of the documentaries we watched.
I remember that.
A sister of one of the victims,
Mm-hmm.
she talked about finding comfort in connecting with other families
That makes sense.
who had been through something similar.
Right, because they understand in a way that no one else can.
She said, "We're all in this together, and we're not going to let our loved ones be forgotten.
Wow.
We're going to fight for justice, for accountability, for a world where this doesn't happen again."
That's incredibly powerful.
It shows that even in the darkest of times,
Mm-hmm.
even when something this horrible happens,
Yeah.
the human spirit can endure.
And sometimes the greatest strength comes from community,
From sharing your pain.
from knowing you're not alone.
And I think it also highlights the importance of empathy,
Absolutely.
of understanding, of listening without judgment.
We can never fully understand what these families went through,
No?
but we can be there for them
Acknowledge their loss.
and honor the memories of their loved ones.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of John Wayne Gacy Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to remember that this story isn't just about a monster.
Right.
It's about the people whose lives he destroyed,
The families he shattered.
the community he tore apart,
It's a story that continues to affect people today,
and it reminds us that evil can hide anywhere.
and that understanding these things is a process.
We're always learning.
And even in the darkest parts of humanity,
Yeah.
there's still hope,
Resilience.
the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most terrible loss.
Thank you all for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you.
It's been a tough one,
It has.
but I think it's important that we confront these dark parts of history,
I agree.
learn from them,
And never forget the victims.
and as we move forward,
Yeah,
let's hold on to the lessons we've learned.
to the importance of empathy and compassion.
And let's carry the stories of the victims with us.
Let their strength inspire us to make the world a better place.
A place where these horrors are never repeated.